The radio crackled with desperate voices. 8 children, 2 teachers, a bus driver, a maintenance worker, all trapped as Hurricane Elena's storm surge turned Riverside Elementary into an island surrounded by 8 feet of churning black water. The winds howled at 140 miles per hour. Every rescue aircraft was grounded. Every protocol said it was impossible. Except Sarah Chen wasn't listening to protocols anymore. She'd been banned from flying for 6 months after her last reckless decision. They called her a maverick, a rule breaker, someone who couldn't follow orders when lives were on the line. But tonight, as those 12 voices pleaded for help over the emergency frequency, Sarah realized that being grounded might have been the worst decision Port Harrison Emergency Services had ever made. The helicopter she wasn't supposed to touch sat 30 feet away. The storm everyone said was too dangerous to fly in raged outside. And somewhere across town, 12 people were running out of time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The maintenance bay at Port Harrison Hurricane Response Station hummed with the low drone of ventilation fans fighting against the humid Florida night. Sarah Chen knelt beside the landing gear of Rescue 47, her fingers working methodically around the hydraulic lines that kept the MH-6 Jayhawk operational. The work was routine, familiar, almost meditative. Check the pressure gauges. Test the fluid levels. Document everything in triplicate. It was the kind of detail-oriented labor that kept aircraft airworthy and crews alive. But it was also a far cry from where she'd been 18 months ago. Back then, Sarah had been Port Harrison's most experienced hurricane pilot. She'd flown through 3 Category 4 storms, pulled 47 people from floodwaters, and earned commendations that lined the walls of her former office. Her hands had guided this same helicopter through conditions that grounded every other aircraft in the region. She knew every vibration, every sound, every subtle shift in the Jayhawk's behavior that meant the difference between a successful rescue and a tragic headline. Now those same hands adjusted wrench tension on maintenance bolts, while other pilots flew the missions she'd once led. The irony wasn't lost on her. She probably knew Rescue 47 better than anyone else in the station, having personally overseen modifications to its weather radar system and convinced the procurement office to upgrade its emergency medical equipment. Yet according to her personnel file, she was too dangerous to be trusted with its controls. The demotion had come after what Commander Morrison called a pattern of reckless decision-making that endangers both equipment and personnel. Sarah preferred to think of it as a pattern of getting people home alive, when everyone else was content to wait for better conditions. The marina rescue had been the final straw. Dense fog, visibility near zero, 3 recreational boaters trapped. On a sinking vessel 2 miles offshore, the books had to wait. Sarah had launched anyway, navigating by instruments and instinct to pull all 3 to safety before their boat went under. Mission successful, lives saved, career destroyed. The disciplinary hearing had been swift and decisive. Commander Morrison, flanked by officials from district headquarters, had read her violations with the enthusiasm of someone announcing cafeteria menu changes. Failure to follow minimum visibility protocols. Unauthorized departure during declared hazardous conditions. Willful disregard for established safety margins. Each charge was technically accurate, and each one ignored the 3 families who'd spent that evening grateful their loved ones had come home. Dr. Amanda Foster, the station's emergency operations director, had been particularly vocal during the proceedings. A meteorologist by training and administrator by necessity, Foster ran emergency response like a mathematical equation. Variables were measured, risks calculated, decisions made within predetermined parameters. Sarah's approach, which relied heavily on experience, intuition, and what Foster termed cowboy instincts, represented everything the new emergency management philosophy sought to eliminate. The data shows, Foster had explained to the review board, that Chun's unauthorized operations, while occasionally successful, create liability exposure and set dangerous precedents for other pilots. We cannot have personnel who consider themselves above established safety protocols. The phrase "occasionally successful" had stung worse than any formal reprimand. Occasionally successful. As if pulling 47 people from certain death across 3 years was some kind of lucky streak rather than the result of skill, preparation, and the willingness to push beyond comfortable margins when lives hung in the balance. Sarah finished her inspection of the landing gear and moved to the engine compartment. The Jayhawk's twin turboshaft engines represented millions of dollars of precision engineering, each component calibrated to perform within exact specifications. She ran her flashlight across the intake screens, checking for debris that could cause catastrophic failure during flight. It was detail work that required focus and expertise, but it also allowed her mind to wander to the conversations happening in the operations center 50 yards away. Hurricane Elena was intensifying faster than predicted. The latest weather models showed the storm making landfall near Port Harrison sometime after midnight, bringing with it winds that would make rescue operations impossible for anyone foolish enough to attempt them. Sarah had watched the satellite imagery during her dinner break, noting the tight spiral structure and clearly defined eye that marked Elena as a mature, dangerous system. The storm's forward speed was also concerning. Fast-moving hurricanes often produced higher storm surges as they pushed ocean water inland with greater force. Captain Rodriguez, who now flew the missions Sarah once handled, had spent the evening briefing his crew on evacuation procedures and shelter protocols. Rodriguez was competent, careful, and thoroughly committed to operating within approved guidelines. He was also inexperienced with hurricane flying, having transferred to Port Harrison only 8 months earlier from a station in North Carolina, where he'd primarily handled routine patrol missions. His by-the-book approach earned praise from Foster and Morrison, but Sarah worried about what would happen when the book didn't cover the situation at hand. The younger pilots looked up to Rodriguez, partly because of his rank and partly because his methodical approach felt safer than Sarah's reputation for improvisation. Lieutenant Walsh, who joined the station fresh from flight school, had been particularly vocal about the importance of following established procedures. Walsh had been present during Sarah's final unauthorized mission, serving as her co-pilot during the Marina rescue. His testimony during the disciplinary hearing had been factual, accurate, and devastating. Chun initiated takeoff without authorization. Walsh had told the review board weather conditions were below minimums for safe flight operations. I expressed concerns about visibility and wind shear, but Chun proceeded with the mission despite lacking proper clearance from operations control. Walsh's account was technically correct, but it missed the context that made Sarah's decision necessary. The Coast Guard station 40 miles south was socked in completely, their aircraft unable to launch. The Navy helicopter unit at Pensacola was committed to a medical evacuation. Every minute of delay meant higher waves, worse conditions, and decreasing chances of survival for the people trapped on that sinking boat. Sarah had made a command decision based on 20 years of flying experience and intimate knowledge of local weather patterns. Walsh had seen only a violation of protocol. The generational divide in emergency services philosophy was something Sarah understood, but found frustrating. Newer pilots trained in modern flight schools learned comprehensive risk management systems designed to minimize accidents and liability. Their education emphasized measured responses, careful planning, and strict adherence to established procedures. These approaches worked well for routine operations and helped prevent the kind of accidents that had plagued earlier generations of emergency responders. But Sarah had learned to fly during an era when emergency response meant improvising solutions to impossible problems. Her early mentors had been Vietnam veterans and old-school Coast Guard pilots who understood that sometimes the book provided guidance rather than absolute rules. They'd taught her to read weather patterns by feel, to push aircraft to their limits when necessary, and to remember that perfect safety for rescuers meant certain death for victims in many situations. The philosophical differences weren't just academic. They shaped every aspect of daily operations at the station. Foster's emphasis on data-driven decision-making had transformed the operations center into something resembling a NASA mission control facility. Multiple computer screens displayed real-time weather data, aircraft tracking information, and risk assessment matrices that color-coded every potential mission based on predetermined safety factors. The system was impressive, comprehensive, and often paralyzed by its own complexity. Sarah remembered simpler times when emergency response meant monitoring radio frequencies, checking weather reports, and launching when people needed help. The old approach had produced its share of accidents and close calls, but it had also resulted in countless successful rescues that would never have happened under current protocols. She sometimes wondered if their increased safety had come at the cost of their effectiveness. Working the maintenance shift meant Sarah rarely interacted with flight crews during operational periods. She arrived at the station each evening as the day shift pilots were completing their final briefings, and she left each morning as the new crews were reviewing weather reports and mission assignments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The schedule was intentional, designed to minimize her contact with active flight operations while still utilizing her technical expertise. Chief Mechanic Bill Stevens had fought to keep Sarah on the maintenance team despite pressure from Morrison to transfer her to a desk job at district headquarters. Stevens, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant with 30 years of experience, understood the value of having a skilled pilot involved in aircraft maintenance. Sarah's insights into aircraft performance and her attention to detail had prevented several potential mechanical failures and identified upgrade opportunities that improved overall fleet readiness. "You know these birds better than anyone," Stevens had told her during a private conversation the week after her grounding. "Morrison might not want you flying them anymore, but I need someone who understands what they go through up there. Maintenance isn't punishment, Chun. It's how we keep everyone else alive." Stevens was right, but the transition from pilot to technician still felt like exile. Sarah had spent most of her adult life defining herself through her ability to fly complex missions under dangerous conditions. Grounding her was like asking a surgeon to become a janitor in the operating room. The knowledge and skills remained, but the opportunity to use them had been stripped away. The irony was that her current position gave her unprecedented access to information about aircraft capabilities and operational readiness. As part of her maintenance duties, Sarah reviewed every inspection report, every performance analysis, and every modification request that crossed the station's desk. She knew which aircraft were running at peak efficiency and which ones had developing problems that might not manifest for weeks. She understood the limitations of each helicopter in the fleet and could predict how they would perform under various weather conditions. More importantly, she had access to Rescue 47 during the hours when everyone else was focused on planning and preparation rather than action. The Jayhawk sat in the maintenance bay like a sleeping giant, its systems checked and rechecked, its fuel tanks topped off, its rescue equipment meticulously organized. Sarah knew every switch, every gauge, every control surface on the aircraft. She'd personally verified that its emergency medical equipment was properly secured and that its weather radar system was calibrated for optimal performance. As Hurricane Elena continued its march toward Port Harrison, Sarah completed her evening inspection routine with growing unease. The weather updates filtering through the maintenance bay radio suggested that the storm was strengthening faster than anticipated and moving toward shore with unprecedented speed. Emergency management officials were calling for complete evacuation of low-lying areas, but the timeline was compressed. Many residents had delayed their departure, expecting to have more time before conditions became dangerous. The combination of a strengthening storm and delayed evacuations created exactly the kind of scenario that produced emergency rescues under impossible conditions. Sarah had lived through enough hurricanes to recognize the pattern. People would wait too long to leave, roads would flood, communications would fail, and somewhere in the chaos, someone would find themselves trapped with no way out except a helicopter willing to fly through conditions that violated every safety protocol in the book. Sarah finished documenting her inspection results and filed the paperwork in the appropriate logbooks. Rescue 47 was fully operational, ready for missions that no one was authorized to fly. She gathered her tools and prepared to move on to the next aircraft on her maintenance schedule. But something made her pause beside the Jayhawk's open crew door. The helicopter's rescue equipment was arranged with the precision she'd learned during her flight training. Rescue harnesses hung in designated locations. Medical supplies were secured but accessible. Emergency flotation devices were positioned for rapid deployment. Everything was exactly as she would have arranged it before launching on a mission. Everything was ready except for someone willing to use it. Sarah closed the crew door and walked toward the next aircraft, but her mind remained focused on Rescue 47 and the growing storm outside. Hurricane Elena was coming, and when it arrived, someone would need help. The question was whether anyone would be willing to provide it. The operations center at Port Harrison Hurricane Response Station buzzed with controlled urgency as Hurricane Elena's outer bands began lashing the Florida coast. Commander Jake Morrison stood at the central command console, his weathered face illuminated by the glow of multiple computer screens displaying satellite imagery, wind speed readings, and evacuation status reports. Around him, a carefully orchestrated dance of emergency management unfolded as personnel monitored radio frequencies, updated tracking charts, and coordinated with civilian authorities across 3 counties. Morrison had run emergency operations for 12 years, transforming what had once been a loosely organized collection of rescue units into a sophisticated command structure that rivaled anything found at major metropolitan emergency centers. His office walls displayed certifications from FEMA, the National Weather Service, and multiple federal agencies recognizing Port Harrison's evolution into a model facility for hurricane response coordination. The transformation had been necessary, Morrison believed, to meet the increasing complexity of modern emergency management and the liability concerns that dominated contemporary public safety operations. Dr. Amanda Foster moved between workstations with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing multiple crisis scenarios simultaneously. Her background in meteorology provided the scientific foundation for the station's weather analysis capabilities, while her advanced degree in emergency management had equipped her with the administrative tools necessary to coordinate complex multi-agency responses. Foster represented the new generation of emergency professionals who approached crisis management as a science rather than an art, relying on data analysis and proven methodologies rather than intuition and improvisation. The evening briefing had concluded 20 minutes earlier with Foster's comprehensive presentation on Hurricane Elena's projected track and intensity. Her analysis indicated that the storm would make landfall approximately 15 miles south of Port Harrison sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning, bringing sustained winds of 140 miles per hour and a storm surge that could reach 12 feet in low-lying areas. The data supported a complete suspension of flight operations until wind speeds dropped below 80 miles per hour, which computer models suggested wouldn't occur until mid-morning at the earliest. Captain Tony Rodriguez reviewed flight crew assignments with the methodical precision that had earned him recognition as one of the station's most reliable pilots. Rodriguez understood that his role extended beyond simply flying rescue missions. As senior pilot, he was responsible for maintaining operational readiness while ensuring that his crews adhered to established safety protocols. The balance between preparedness and caution required constant attention to weather conditions, equipment status, and personnel capabilities. Rodriguez had witnessed the consequences of overly aggressive flight operations during his previous assignment at a Coast Guard station in North Carolina. A helicopter crew attempting a rescue during a winter storm had encountered unexpected wind shear that resulted in a hard landing and injuries to both crew members and rescued personnel. The incident had reinforced his belief that emergency response required careful risk assessment rather than heroic gestures that endangered everyone involved. Lieutenant Mike Walsh occupied a workstation near the communications center, monitoring radio traffic from evacuation routes and emergency shelters throughout the region. Walsh's methodical approach to operations management reflected his recent training at the Coast Guard Academy, where he'd studied emergency response theory and risk mitigation strategies. His textbook knowledge of proper procedures sometimes clashed with the improvisational traditions of veteran emergency responders, but Walsh believed that systematic approaches produced more consistent results than relying on individual judgment calls. The generational divide in emergency response philosophy was evident throughout the operations center. Veteran personnel who'd learned their skills during an era of simpler equipment and less sophisticated weather forecasting often chafed at the elaborate procedures now required for routine operations. Younger staff members, trained in modern emergency management programs, sometimes viewed their older colleagues as relics from a more dangerous time, when unnecessary risks were accepted as normal parts of the job. Morrison navigated these tensions by emphasizing the importance of following established protocols while acknowledging the experience and expertise of his veteran personnel. The approach worked well during routine operations, but created friction when rapidly evolving situations demanded quick decisions that didn't fit neatly into predetermined categories. Hurricane Elena represented exactly the kind of complex, fast-moving crisis that tested the flexibility of rigid operational frameworks. Foster's weather analysis indicated that Elena was intensifying more rapidly than initial projections had suggested. The storm's central pressure had dropped significantly during the previous 6 hours, and satellite imagery showed the development of concentric eye walls that often preceded major strengthening in mature hurricane systems. The implications were serious. Evacuation timelines that had seemed adequate 12 hours earlier were now compressed, and coastal areas that might have remained habitable during a Category 3 storm faced the prospect of catastrophic damage from a major hurricane. Emergency management officials throughout the region were scrambling to accelerate evacuation procedures, but the compressed timeline created logistical challenges that no amount of planning could entirely address. Traffic congestion on evacuation routes had reached critical levels as residents who delayed their departure attempted to reach inland shelters. Emergency services were reporting stranded motorists, flooded roadways, and communication failures that complicated coordination efforts. The strain on emergency response systems was becoming apparent in the operations center as radio traffic increased, and reports of developing problems began filtering in from across the region. Foster coordinated with county emergency managers to prioritize resource allocation, but the rapid deterioration of conditions meant that some areas would inevitably be cut off from assistance until the storm passed. The reality of hurricane response was that emergency services could only help those who were accessible, and Elena's accelerated timeline was shrinking the window for reaching people who'd waited too long to evacuate. Rodriguez briefed his flight crews on the evolving situation while emphasizing the importance of maintaining discipline regarding flight operations. The temptation to launch premature rescue missions would increase as reports of stranded people began coming in, but Rodriguez stressed that putting aircrew at risk served no purpose if weather conditions made successful rescues impossible. His approach reflected contemporary emergency management doctrine that prioritized sustainable operations over heroic gestures that might compromise overall response capabilities. Walsh monitored evacuation progress through his communications console, noting areas where the process was proceeding smoothly and others where developing problems threatened to leave residents stranded. Riverside Elementary School had reported successful completion of its evacuation procedures, with all students and staff safely transported to designated shelters by mid-afternoon. The school's location in a low-lying area near Harrison Bay made it particularly vulnerable to storm surge, but early evacuation had ensured that the building would be empty when Elena made landfall. The evening's operational briefing had covered contingency plans for various storm scenarios, but the rapidly changing conditions were forcing real-time adjustments to established procedures. Foster's computer models provided sophisticated analysis of Elena's likely track and intensity, but the data also highlighted the uncertainty inherent in hurricane forecasting. Small changes in the storm's path or strength could significantly alter the areas at greatest risk and the resources needed to respond effectively. Morrison's command philosophy emphasized preparation over reaction, an approach that had served the station well during previous hurricane seasons. Emergency response equipment was pre-positioned at strategic locations throughout the region. Personnel assignments were clearly defined and backed up with alternate staffing plans. Communication protocols were established and tested. Supply chains were secured and verified. The systematic approach reduced confusion during crisis situations and helped ensure that resources were available when needed. However, the systematic approach also created organizational momentum that made rapid course corrections difficult when situations evolved faster than planning cycles could accommodate. Elena's accelerated intensification represented exactly the kind of unpredictable development that challenged inflexible operational frameworks. The storm was becoming more dangerous than anticipated. Evacuation timelines were compressed, and traditional response protocols might prove inadequate for the conditions actually developing. Foster's analysis indicated that Elena's storm surge would arrive earlier and with greater force than initial projections had suggested. Coastal areas that might have remained accessible during the early hours of the storm would likely be inundated by rapidly rising water that could trap residents who'd assumed they had more time to evacuate. The compressed timeline meant that emergency services would have fewer opportunities to assist people who found themselves in dangerous situations as conditions deteriorated. The Operations Center's sophisticated monitoring capabilities provided unprecedented visibility into Elena's development and movement, but the data also revealed the limitations of even the most advanced forecasting systems. Weather was fundamentally chaotic, and hurricane behavior involved complex interactions between atmospheric conditions that could produce rapid changes in storm characteristics. The computer models that guided emergency planning were excellent tools, but they couldn't eliminate the uncertainty that made hurricane response such a challenging field. Rodriguez understood that his flight crews would face enormous pressure to attempt rescue missions as reports of stranded people began coming in during the night. The emotional impact of emergency calls was difficult to resist, especially for personnel who'd joined emergency services specifically to help people in danger. However, Rodriguez also understood that unsuccessful rescue attempts could result in additional casualties and reduce overall response capabilities when conditions improved enough to make effective operations possible. The balance between caution and action was one of the most difficult aspects of emergency management. Too much caution could leave people in danger when help might have been possible. Too little caution could result in preventable accidents that a limited resources needed for later operations. Rodriguez's job was to find the appropriate balance based on conditions, capabilities, and the likelihood of successful outcomes. Walsh's communications monitoring revealed the human dimension of Elena's approach as emergency calls began filtering in from across the region. Families reporting elderly relatives who'd refused to evacuate. Motorists stranded by flooded roads. Emergency workers caught in deteriorating conditions while attempting to complete final preparations. Each call represented someone in potential danger, but responding to every request would quickly overwhelm available resources and likely result in emergency personnel being caught in dangerous situations when the storm's full force arrived. The evening's briefing had emphasized the importance of maintaining operational discipline during the critical hours when Elena made landfall. Emergency services would face tremendous pressure to respond to developing situations, but premature action could compromise their ability to provide effective assistance when conditions improved. The strategy required accepting that some people might face dangerous situations that couldn't be addressed immediately, a reality that conflicted with the fundamental impulse that drew most people to emergency services. Morrison's command approach reflected years of experience managing complex emergency operations where emotional pressures could overwhelm rational decision-making. His role required balancing the immediate demands of crisis response with longer-term considerations about resource management and personnel safety. The approach had proven effective during previous hurricanes, but Elena's rapid intensification was creating a situation that tested the flexibility of established procedures. Foster's meteorological analysis provided the scientific foundation for operational decisions, but her data also highlighted the inherent uncertainty in hurricane forecasting that made emergency management such a challenging field. Computer models could project likely scenarios, but they couldn't eliminate the possibility of unexpected developments that could dramatically alter the situation. Elena's behavior during the previous 12 hours demonstrated how quickly hurricane characteristics could change and how those changes could invalidate carefully developed response plans. The Operations Center represented the culmination of years of investment in modern emergency management capabilities, but the sophisticated systems also created organizational complexity that could hinder rapid adaptation to changing conditions. Multiple computer screens displayed real-time data about Elena's characteristics and movement, but translating that information into effective operational decisions required human judgment that no amount of technology could replace. Rodriguez's flight crews represented some of the most skilled helicopter pilots in emergency services, but their training emphasized systematic approaches to mission planning that might prove inadequate for the rapidly evolving situation Elena was creating. The storm's compressed timeline meant that traditional planning cycles couldn't keep pace with developing conditions, and standard risk assessment procedures might not adequately address the unique challenges Elena was presenting. As Elena's outer bands began reaching Port Harrison, the Operations Center settled into its crisis management rhythm. Personnel monitored their assigned systems, updated tracking information, and coordinated with external agencies according to established protocols. The systematic approach had served them well during previous emergencies, but Elena's unexpected behavior was about to test whether their rigid procedures could adapt quickly enough to address the unprecedented challenges the storm was bringing to their community. Sarah completed her inspection of the station's backup aircraft, a smaller HH-65 Dolphin that served as secondary support for routine operations. The Dolphin was reliable and well-maintained, but its limitations became apparent when compared to the larger Jayhawk's capabilities. Lighter construction made it more vulnerable to severe weather conditions. Reduced fuel capacity limited its operational range. Smaller crew compartment restricted the number of people it could carry during evacuation missions. In calm weather, the Dolphin performed adequately, But Hurricane Elena's projected conditions would push the aircraft beyond its effective operational envelope. Working methodically through her maintenance checklist, Sarah noted discrepancies that wouldn't normally concern flight crews, but could become critical under extreme conditions. The Dolphin's weather radar system was functioning within acceptable parameters, but its calibration showed subtle variations that would reduce effectiveness in heavy precipitation. The emergency flotation system met all regulatory requirements, but recent testing had revealed minor delays in deployment that could prove significant if the aircraft were forced to ditch in rough seas. These details weren't failures or violations of maintenance standards. They were the kinds of minor variations that occurred in complex mechanical systems and typically fell within acceptable operational tolerances. However, Sarah's experience flying rescue missions in severe weather had taught her that minor limitations could become major problems when conditions pushed aircraft beyond their normal operating environments. She documented her observations in the maintenance log, knowing that few people would understand their significance. The maintenance bay's radio provided a constant stream of updates about Elena's approach and the evolving emergency response situation. Weather reports indicated that the hurricane's forward speed had increased, bringing the timeline for landfall closer to midnight than the originally projected early morning arrival. Storm surge predictions had been revised upward, as Elena's strengthening low-pressure center enhanced its ability to push ocean water inland. Coastal flooding was now expected to begin several hours before the storm's eye reached shore. Sarah paused in her work to review the latest satellite imagery displayed on a computer terminal near the maintenance office. Elena's spiral structure had tightened considerably during the previous 6 hours, and the storm's eye had contracted to a diameter of less than 20 miles. Both characteristics indicated continued intensification and suggested that Elena might reach Category 5 strength before making landfall. The implications for emergency operations were sobering. Category 5 hurricanes produced wind speeds that made helicopter operations impossible, even for the most experienced crews. The computer display also showed Elena's projected track, which had shifted slightly northward during recent updates. The new projection placed Port Harrison closer to the storm's northeastern quadrant, where hurricane-force winds would arrive earlier and persist longer than in other areas relative to the storm center. Emergency operations would face an extended period of dangerous conditions that could last well into the following day. Sarah returned to her inspection routine, but her mind remained focused on the tactical challenges Elena would present for helicopter operations. Wind speeds above 100 miles per hour made controlled flight impossible for most aircraft. Horizontal visibility could drop to near zero in heavy precipitation and blowing debris. Vertical wind shear created unpredictable flight conditions that could overwhelm even the most sophisticated aircraft control systems. Emergency landing sites would be limited as flooding eliminated many of the open areas normally available for helicopter operations. Her experience flying through 3 major hurricanes had taught her that successful operations required intimate knowledge of local geography and weather patterns that couldn't be learned from charts or computer displays. Coastal wind patterns changed dramatically during hurricane conditions as the storm circulation interacted with land features. Harbor areas that provided sheltered approaches during normal weather could become wind tunnels during hurricane conditions. Elevation changes that were insignificant during routine flights could create dangerous turbulence when combined with extreme wind speeds. Sarah had spent years developing mental maps of Port Harrison's geography that included details invisible to conventional navigation systems. She knew which areas flooded first during storm surge events and which higher ground remained accessible when coastal roads became impassable. Her familiarity with local landmarks extended beyond simple navigation to include understanding how those features would appear during hurricane conditions when normal visual references might be obscured or destroyed. The Riverside Elementary School area presented particular challenges for helicopter operations during severe weather. The school's location in a bowl-shaped depression provided some protection from horizontal winds, but created turbulence patterns that could be dangerous for aircraft attempting to land or hover. Surrounding trees and power lines that posed minimal risk during normal conditions would become serious hazards if damaged by hurricane-force winds. Access routes that appeared straightforward on aviation charts included obstacles that were apparent only to pilots familiar with ground-level details. Sarah's mental inventory of Elena's challenges extended beyond geographic considerations to include the capabilities and limitations of available aircraft. Rescue 47's upgraded weather radar system could penetrate heavy precipitation more effectively than older equipment, but it still had limitations in extreme conditions. The Jayhawk's twin-engine configuration provided redundancy that could prove critical if foreign object damage disabled one turbine. Its larger size and weight offered better stability in turbulent conditions, but reduced maneuverability in confined spaces. More importantly, Sarah understood Rescue 47's performance characteristics under extreme conditions because she'd personally tested them during previous hurricane operations. She knew how the aircraft handled during autorotation procedures when engine power was reduced. She'd experienced the helicopter's behavior during sideways flight in strong crosswinds. Her muscle memory included the precise control inputs needed to maintain stable hover positions when surface winds created unpredictable updrafts and downdrafts. The maintenance documentation for Rescue 47 included modifications Sarah had requested and overseen during her time as senior pilot. Upgraded emergency medical equipment reflected lessons learned during previous rescue operations. Enhanced communication systems improved coordination with ground personnel and other aircraft. Reinforced cargo areas could accommodate larger numbers of evacuees without compromising structural integrity. These improvements weren't documented in standard technical manuals, but Sarah understood their capabilities intimately. Her current position in the maintenance department provided access to information about aircraft status and operational readiness that wasn't available to flight crews until immediately before missions. Sarah knew which systems had been recently serviced and which ones were approaching scheduled maintenance intervals. She understood the significance of minor discrepancies that might not appear in standard briefing materials but could affect aircraft performance under extreme conditions. The radio traffic from the operations center revealed growing concerns about evacuation delays and the possibility that some residents might be trapped by rapidly deteriorating conditions. Emergency management officials were reporting traffic congestion on evacuation routes that was preventing people from reaching designated shelters before dangerous weather arrived. Communication failures were complicating coordination efforts and creating uncertainty about the status of evacuation procedures in remote areas. Sarah listened to these reports while continuing her maintenance routine, but her experience with hurricane response enabled her to read between the lines of official communications. Phrases like evacuation delays and communication difficulties often indicated that people were stranded in dangerous locations with limited options for reaching safety. Traffic congestion frequently meant that emergency vehicles couldn't reach areas where assistance was needed. Coordination challenges usually suggested that emergency services were losing track of people who might require rescue operations. The compressed timeline created by Elena's accelerated approach meant that traditional emergency response procedures were struggling to keep pace with developing conditions. Evacuation plans that assumed 12 to 18 hours of preparation time were being compressed into 6 to 8 hours. Emergency services that normally had adequate time to position resources and coordinate operations were scrambling to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Sarah's experience during previous hurricanes had taught her that the gap between official plans and actual conditions often created opportunities for individual initiative when formal procedures proved inadequate. Emergency operations that worked. While during controlled exercises sometimes broke down when confronted with the chaos and uncertainty of actual disaster response, personnel who understood local conditions and possessed relevant experience could often identify solutions that weren't apparent to command staff operating from remote locations. The maintenance bay's elevated position provided a clear view of Elena's approach as the storm's outer bands began affecting Port Harrison. Wind speeds were increasing steadily, and periodic rain squalls reduced visibility across the airfield. Emergency lighting systems had been activated to provide backup illumination when primary power systems failed. Aircraft that weren't secured in hangars were being subjected to increasing stress as wind speeds approached levels that could cause structural damage. Sarah observed these conditions while mentally calculating the window of opportunity for helicopter operations. Elena's forward speed meant that hurricane-force winds would arrive earlier than originally projected, but it also meant that the storm would move through the area more quickly than initially anticipated. The period of maximum danger would be shorter but more intense than typical hurricane scenarios. Emergency operations might have a brief window of opportunity after Elena's eye passed over the area, but that window would require immediate action. When weather conditions improved enough to make flight operations marginally possible, her analysis of the evolving situation suggested that conventional emergency response procedures were poorly suited to Elena's compressed timeline and unusual characteristics. Standard protocols assumed that emergency services would have adequate time to assess conditions, plan operations, and implement coordinated responses. Elena's rapid approach and intensification were eliminating many of the assumptions underlying traditional hurricane response strategies. The implications extended beyond operational procedures to include the personnel and equipment needed for effective emergency response. Flight crews trained in standard hurricane protocols might lack the experience necessary to operate effectively during Elena's unique conditions. Aircraft configured for routine emergency operations might prove inadequate for the extreme challenges Elena would present. Communication systems that worked well during normal emergencies might fail when confronted with Elena's unprecedented combination of intensity and speed. Sarah completed her maintenance inspection and prepared to move to the next aircraft on her schedule, but her attention remained focused on Rescue 47 and the growing recognition that Elena would likely create emergency situations that exceeded the capabilities of current response procedures. The storm's characteristics suggested that successful operations would require personnel with extensive hurricane experience and aircraft capable of operating under extreme conditions. More importantly, effective response would demand the flexibility to adapt quickly when predetermined plans proved inadequate for actual conditions. The maintenance bay grew quieter as Elena's outer bands intensified and personnel who weren't essential for immediate operations sought shelter in reinforced areas of the facility. Sarah remained at her workstation, methodically completing her assigned tasks while monitoring radio communications and weather updates. Her position provided a unique perspective on the station's operational readiness and the developing challenges Elena would soon present to emergency response capabilities. Throughout the region, Tommy Chun hunched over his communications console in the station's main operations center, his headset crackling with increasingly urgent radio traffic as Hurricane Elena's effects spread across the coastal region. As the night shift communications specialist, Tommy normally monitored routine emergency calls and coordinated with other agencies during relatively quiet overnight hours. Tonight, however, his console buzzed with reports of stranded motorists, power outages, and communication failures that painted a picture of rapidly deteriorating conditions throughout his coverage area. The relationship between Tommy and his older sister Sarah remained complicated by her recent demotion and the circumstances that had led to her grounding. Tommy had witnessed firsthand the disciplinary proceedings that ended Sarah's flying career, and while he understood the official rationale for the decision, he also knew that his sister's aggressive approach to emergency response had saved lives that might have been lost under more cautious operational procedures. The tension between following regulations and achieving results was something Tommy experienced daily in his own work. Communication specialists occupied a unique position in emergency response operations. Their role required monitoring multiple radio frequencies simultaneously while maintaining detailed logs of all emergency calls and agency coordination efforts. They served as the information hub that connected field operations with command staff and external agencies. During major events like hurricane response, communications personnel often had better situational awareness than anyone else in the organization because they received unfiltered reports from across the entire operational area. Tommy's console displayed a comprehensive overview of emergency activity throughout the three-county region, served by Port Harrison's Operations Center. Color-coded indicators showed the status of evacuation procedures, emergency shelter occupancy, and resource deployment across dozens of communities. Radio channels carried traffic from law enforcement agencies, emergency medical services, fire departments, and emergency management officials coordinating response efforts. The volume of activity was increasing steadily as Elena's approach created new problems faster than existing resources could address them. One of the most concerning developments was the growing number of reports about delayed or incomplete evacuations. Communities that should have been empty hours earlier were reporting residents who'd refused to leave or had been unable to complete their departure preparations before transportation became dangerous. Emergency management officials were struggling to maintain accurate accountability for people in threatened areas, and communication failures were making it impossible to verify the status of evacuation procedures in some locations. Tommy monitored traffic from evacuation routes throughout the region, noting areas where flooding or debris was creating delays that could trap people in dangerous locations. Interstate highways that served as primary evacuation corridors were experiencing severe congestion as residents who delayed their departure attempted to reach inland shelters. Local roads in low-lying areas were beginning to flood as Elena's storm surge effects reached inland water systems. Emergency services were reporting multiple locations where motorists had been forced to abandon vehicles and seek shelter in whatever buildings were available. The compressed timeline created by Elena's accelerated approach was overwhelming evacuation procedures that had been designed for more typical hurricane scenarios. Emergency managers had based their planning on historical data showing that major hurricanes typically approached coastal areas over 12 to 18-hour periods, providing adequate time for systematic evacuation procedures. Elena's rapid movement meant that dangerous conditions were arriving 6 to 8 hours earlier than normal patterns would suggest. Communication systems throughout the region were experiencing increasing stress as Elena's outer bands brought wind and precipitation that interfered with radio transmissions and damaged infrastructure. Cell phone towers were losing power or suffering antenna damage that reduced coverage in critical areas. Emergency radio networks were functioning, but experiencing interference that made coordination more difficult. Some communities had lost contact entirely with regional emergency management centers, creating uncertainty about conditions and resource needs in those areas. Tommy's monitoring duties included tracking the status of critical facilities throughout the region, including hospitals, emergency shelters, and essential services installations. Most facilities had completed their preparation procedures and were ready to ride out the storm, but several were reporting problems that could compromise their ability to maintain operations during extended power outages. Emergency generators that had tested successfully were experiencing fuel supply problems. Backup communication systems were revealing integration issues that hadn't been apparent during routine testing. One particularly troubling report came from the Riverside Elementary School area, where a school bus returning from a delayed field trip had encountered flooding that prevented it from reaching its intended destination. The driver had taken shelter at the school building, but the facility wasn't equipped for extended occupancy and would be vulnerable to Elena's storm surge. Effects. Emergency management officials were aware of the situation, but were unable to respond immediately due to deteriorating conditions that made travel dangerous for rescue personnel. The school bus incident represented exactly the kind of unexpected development that could overwhelm emergency response capabilities during major disasters. Official evacuation procedures assumed that all transportation would be completed before dangerous conditions developed. But Elena's compressed timeline had caught the bus in transit when flooding made continued travel impossible. Standard protocols called for emergency services to respond to such situations, but Elena's intensity was making immediate response impossible. Tommy relayed information about the stranded bus to the operations center's command staff, but the response was predictably cautious. Commander Morrison and Dr. Foster reviewed weather data and concluded that rescue operations wouldn't be possible until Elena passed through the area and conditions improved enough to make helicopter flights feasible. The decision was tactically sound but left 12 people trapped in a building that would be inundated by storm surge within hours. The broader pattern of Elena's impact was becoming clear through Tommy's communications monitoring. The storm's unusual characteristics were creating situations that didn't fit neatly into established emergency response categories, accelerated timeline compressed evacuation procedures. Intensified winds made rescue operations impossible earlier than normal. Enhanced storm surge threatened areas that were normally safe during hurricane conditions. Traditional response procedures were proving inadequate for Elena's unique combination of speed and intensity. Emergency shelters throughout the region were reporting higher than anticipated occupancy as people who'd planned to evacuate to distant locations found themselves unable to complete their travel plans. Shelter managers were implementing overflow procedures and requesting additional supplies to accommodate unexpected populations. Some facilities were approaching capacity limits that could force them to turn away people seeking assistance during the storm's most dangerous hours. Tommy's console also received reports from emergency medical services about people with critical health conditions who were trapped in areas that would soon become inaccessible. Dialysis patients who'd missed treatments due to transportation problems. Elderly residents dependent on oxygen equipment that would fail when power was lost. People with mobility limitations who couldn't evacuate without assistance that was no longer available. Each situation represented a potential tragedy that emergency services were powerless to prevent under current conditions. The psychological impact of Elena's approach was evident in the radio traffic Tommy monitored throughout the evening. Emergency personnel, who normally maintained professional composure, were showing signs of stress as they struggled to adapt their standard procedures to unprecedented conditions. Dispatch operators were receiving increasing numbers of panic calls from people who realized they'd waited too long to evacuate and were now trapped by deteriorating conditions. Emergency managers were making difficult decisions about resource allocation when every option involved unacceptable risks. Weather Service reports indicated that Elena's intensity was continuing to increase as the storm approached shore. Sustained winds had reached 145 miles per hour, placing Elena firmly in Category 4 range with potential for further strengthening to Category 5 status. Storm surge predictions had been revised upward again, with some coastal areas now expected to experience water levels 15 feet above normal. The timeline for landfall had been moved up to approximately 11:30 p.m., nearly 3 hours earlier than original projections. Tommy understood that his sister Sarah was monitoring the same information from her position in the maintenance bay, and he suspected that she was developing her own analysis of Elena's challenges and the inadequacy of current response capabilities. Sarah's experience with hurricane operations gave her insights that weren't available to most emergency personnel, and her current access to aircraft systems information provided unique perspective on potential solutions to developing problems. The communication traffic Tommy monitored included increasing reports of people in distress who couldn't be assisted under current conditions. Emergency services were reaching the limits of their capabilities hours before Elena's most dangerous conditions would arrive. The gap between what people needed and what emergency responders could provide was widening as the storm approached, and standard procedures offered no solutions for the unprecedented challenges Elena was creating. Dr. Foster's meteorological analysis confirmed that Elena represented an unusual combination of characteristics that challenged traditional hurricane response strategies. The storm's rapid approach eliminated much of the preparation time normally available for emergency operations. Its continued intensification meant that dangerous conditions would persist longer than typical storms. Its projected track placed Port Harrison in the area where Elena's effects would be most severe and longest lasting. Tommy's communications monitoring revealed the human dimension of Elena's approach as emergency calls began coming in from across the region. Families reporting missing relatives who'd attempted to evacuate but hadn't reached their destinations. Emergency workers trapped by flooding while attempting to complete final preparations. Residents who'd ignored evacuation orders and now found themselves in buildings that wouldn't survive Elena's storm surge. Each call represented someone whose life was in immediate danger, but responding to the calls would require capabilities that didn't exist under current operational constraints. The Operations Center's sophisticated emergency management systems provided unprecedented visibility into Elena's development and approach, but the technology couldn't solve the fundamental problem that the storm was creating conditions beyond the capabilities of available response resources. Computer displays showed real-time information about wind speeds, storm surge, and precipitation, but they also revealed the limitations of emergency services when confronted with disasters that exceeded normal operational parameters. As Elena's outer bands intensified and began affecting Port Harrison directly, Tommy's communications console became the focal point for information about developing emergencies throughout the region. His position provided a comprehensive view of how Elena's unusual characteristics were overwhelming traditional emergency response capabilities and creating situations that demanded immediate action despite conditions that made such action officially impossible. Commander Morrison stood before the assembled emergency response team in Port Harrison's main operations center, his expression reflecting the gravity of Hurricane Elena's unprecedented approach. The evening briefing had been moved up by 2 hours as weather conditions deteriorated faster than anyone had anticipated, and the room buzzed with tension as personnel absorbed the implications of the latest forecasts. Elena was no longer following predictable patterns, and the storm's unusual behavior was forcing real-time adjustments to carefully developed emergency response procedures. Dr. Foster's presentation dominated the center's main display screen, with satellite imagery that showed Elena's tightly wound circulation and clearly defined eyewall structure. The storm had strengthened to Category 4 intensity with sustained winds of 145 miles per hour, and meteorological data suggested further intensification was possible before landfall. More concerning was Elena's forward speed, which had increased significantly during the past 6 hours and would bring hurricane-force winds to Port Harrison nearly 4 hours earlier than originally projected. Current models show landfall at approximately 11:30 p.m., Foster announced, her voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone accustomed to delivering serious weather briefings. Storm surge predictions have been revised upward to 15 feet above mean high tide in the most vulnerable areas. Coastal flooding will begin approximately 2 hours before the eye makes landfall, and dangerous conditions will persist for 8 to 10 hours after the storm passes. Captain Rodriguez reviewed flight operations status with methodical precision, his analysis reflecting years of experience managing helicopter crews during extreme weather events. All aircraft had been moved to reinforced hangars or secured with multiple tie-down systems, designed to withstand Category 5 wind speeds. Flight operations would remain suspended until sustained winds dropped below 80 miles per hour and visibility improved to minimum safe levels for helicopter operations. We have 3 aircraft in primary operational status, Rodriguez reported. Rescue 47 is fully mission-ready with upgraded weather systems and extended-range fuel capacity. Rescue 23 is operational but limited by older radar equipment that may not penetrate heavy precipitation effectively. The backup Dolphin is mechanically sound but unsuitable for operations in hurricane-force winds. Lieutenant Walsh coordinated communication procedures with external agencies, ensuring that Port Harrison's Operations Center maintained connectivity with County Emergency Management, State Disaster Response Headquarters, and Federal Coordination Centers. The complex network of radio frequencies, satellite communications, and internet-based information systems required constant monitoring to prevent the kind of communication failures that had plagued emergency response during previous major disasters. Morrison's command approach emphasized systematic planning and careful risk assessment, principles that had served Port Harrison well during previous hurricane seasons. Emergency response equipment was pre-positioned throughout the region according to predetermined plans that accounted for likely damage patterns and resource requirements. Personnel assignments included primary and backup responsibilities to ensure operational continuity if key staff members were unavailable. Supply chains were secured and verified to support extended operations without external assistance. However, Elena's unusual characteristics were challenging the assumptions underlying these carefully developed procedures. The storm's accelerated timeline compressed preparation periods that emergency plans assumed would be available. Its projected intensity threatened to exceed the operational parameters for much of the station's equipment. Most importantly, Elena's combination of speed and strength was creating a situation where traditional hurricane response procedures might prove inadequate for the actual conditions developing. Foster's analysis included detailed computer modeling of Elena's likely track and intensity, but the meteorologist was careful to emphasize the limitations of hurricane forecasting when storms exhibited unusual behavior. Elena's rapid intensification and increased forward speed were characteristics that challenged predictive models, and small changes in the storm's development could significantly alter its impact on emergency operations. "We're dealing with a storm that's behaving outside normal parameters," Foster explained. "Computer models provide guidance, but Elena's characteristics suggest we should prepare for conditions that may exceed our standard operational envelopes. This is not a typical Category 4 hurricane, and our response procedures need to account for that reality." Rodriguez understood that his flight crews would face enormous pressure to attempt rescue missions as reports of people in distress began filtering in throughout the night. Emergency services personnel were motivated by a fundamental desire to help people in danger, and the emotional impact of emergency calls could overwhelm rational analysis of operational risks. His responsibility was to maintain flight discipline, while ensuring that aircraft remained available for missions when conditions improved enough to make successful operations possible. The balance between preparedness and caution required constant evaluation of weather conditions, equipment capabilities, and crew readiness. Rodriguez's experience included multiple hurricane responses where premature launch decisions had resulted in aircraft damage and crew injuries that reduced overall response capabilities when they were most needed. Elena's projected conditions would test that balance more severely than any storm he'd previously encountered. Morrison reviewed coordination procedures with civilian authorities, emphasizing the importance of maintaining clear communication channels despite the communication difficulties Elena was likely to create. Emergency management officials throughout the region were implementing their highest-level activation procedures, but the storm's compressed timeline was creating coordination challenges that tested the flexibility of interagency cooperation agreements. Emergency shelters throughout the region were reporting capacity concerns as evacuation delays forced more people to seek public shelter rather than evacuating to distant locations. Some facilities were implementing overflow procedures and requesting additional supplies to accommodate unexpected populations. The shelter system was functioning but operating near maximum capacity with several hours remaining before Elena's most dangerous conditions would arrive. Walsh's communication monitoring revealed growing concerns about incomplete evacuations and the possibility that significant numbers of people might be trapped in vulnerable locations when Elena made landfall. Traffic congestion on evacuation routes was preventing some residents from reaching designated shelters, and communication failures were making it difficult to verify evacuation status in remote areas. Emergency management officials were losing track of people who might require assistance when conditions deteriorated. The compressed timeline was also affecting emergency response positioning, as personnel and equipment that should have been pre-deployed to forward locations were forced to remain at primary facilities due to rapidly deteriorating travel conditions. Emergency services that normally established advanced positions to provide immediate post-storm response were finding their deployment windows eliminated by Elena's accelerated approach. Foster's weather analysis indicated that Elena's storm surge would arrive earlier and with greater force than standard hurricane models predicted. Coastal flooding was expected to begin within 2 hours, and water levels in low-lying areas could rise 8 to 10 feet within 3 hours. Areas that had never flooded during previous hurricanes would experience inundation that could trap residents who'd assumed their locations were safe. The storm surge's early arrival meant that escape routes would be cut off before many people realized the severity of their situation. Morrison's operational review included assessment of available resources and their limitations under Elena's projected conditions. Ground-based emergency vehicles would become ineffective once flooding reached significant levels, and their crews would need to evacuate to secure locations before becoming trapped themselves. Marine assets were already secured and wouldn't be deployable until well after Elena passed through the area. Helicopter operations represented the only potential means of reaching people in flooded areas, but those aircraft couldn't operate safely in Elena's projected wind conditions. The gap between emergency response capabilities and likely requirements was becoming apparent to everyone in the operations center. Standard hurricane response procedures assumed that dangerous conditions would develop gradually over 12 to 18 hours, providing adequate time for systematic evacuation and resource positioning. Elena's compressed timeline was eliminating most of those preparation opportunities while creating a situation where emergency needs would exceed available response capabilities. Rodriguez emphasized the importance of maintaining aircraft in operational readiness despite the decision to suspend flight operations during Elena's passage. Helicopter crews needed to be prepared for immediate deployment once conditions improved enough to make rescue missions possible. However, the definition of improved conditions would need to be adjusted for Elena's unique circumstances, and flight crews would likely face pressure to launch operations under marginal weather conditions. The evening briefing included discussion of post-storm response priorities, but Elena's unusual characteristics made it difficult to predict what conditions would exist after the hurricane passed through the area. Traditional recovery operations assumed that emergency services would have several hours of calm weather to assess damage and begin rescue operations. Elena's rapid movement might provide a shorter recovery window before deteriorating conditions. Returned, compress the time available for effective response. Walsh reported increasing radio traffic from emergency services throughout the region as Elena's outer bands began affecting coastal areas. Wind speeds were rising steadily, and periodic rain squalls were reducing visibility on major transportation routes. Emergency vehicles were experiencing difficulty maintaining normal response capabilities, and several agencies had begun implementing modified procedures that prioritized crew safety over immediate response to all emergency calls. Foster's meteorological analysis suggested that Elena's eye would pass directly over or very close to Port Harrison, potentially providing a brief period of calm conditions that could be used for emergency operations. However, the eye's small diameter meant that any such opportunity would last less than 30 minutes before dangerous winds resumed from the opposite direction. Emergency services would need to be prepared for immediate action if they hoped to take advantage of this narrow window. Morrison understood that his command decisions during the next several hours would likely determine the effectiveness of Port Harrison's emergency response to Elena and its aftermath. The storm's unprecedented characteristics required flexibility in applying established procedures, but deviation from proven protocols carried risks that could compromise overall operations. His experience suggested that successful emergency management required balancing adherence to tested procedures with adaptation to unique circumstances. The Operations Center's communication systems provided real-time connectivity with emergency management officials throughout the region, but the information they were receiving painted an increasingly troubling picture of Elena's impact. Evacuation procedures that should have been completed hours earlier were still in progress in some areas. Communication failures were making it impossible to verify the status of residents in vulnerable locations. Emergency shelters were approaching capacity limits that could force them to turn away people seeking assistance. Rodriguez's flight crew briefings emphasized the importance of maintaining readiness despite the suspension of immediate operations. Helicopter crews needed to remain available for rapid deployment once weather conditions improved, but they also needed to understand that Elena's passage would likely create emergency situations that exceeded normal operational parameters. Flight operations would resume under marginal conditions that required exceptional skill and judgment from all crew members. The psychological pressure on emergency response personnel was becoming evident as Elena approached. Emergency services. Workers who joined their agencies to help people in distress were being forced to wait helplessly while conditions deteriorated and reports of people in danger increased. The emotional impact of emergency calls was particularly difficult for personnel who understood that delayed response could mean the difference between life and death for people seeking assistance. Walsh's monitoring of regional emergency communications revealed the broader scope of Elena's impact on emergency response capabilities. Multiple counties were reporting similar problems with incomplete evacuations, communication failures, and resource limitations that would compromise their ability to respond effectively to the storm's aftermath. Port Harrison's challenges were representative of region-wide problems that would require coordinated response efforts once Elena passed through the area. Foster's weather updates indicated that Elena's intensity was plateauing near Category 4 strength, but the storm's forward speed continued to increase as it approached the coast. The combination of intense winds and rapid movement would create extreme conditions that lasted for a shorter period than typical major hurricanes, but with potentially greater destructive impact. Emergency operations would need to adapt to Elena's compressed timeline while preparing for immediate post-storm response requirements. Morrison's command experience included previous hurricanes, where post-storm conditions had proven more challenging than the storms themselves. Power outages that lasted for weeks, communication failures that prevented coordination between emergency agencies, transportation networks that remained impassable for days after storms passed. Elena's intensity suggested that its aftermath could create unprecedented challenges for emergency response operations throughout the region. The Operations Center's sophisticated monitoring capabilities provided comprehensive information about Elena's approach and likely impact, but the data also revealed the limitations of emergency response systems when confronted with storms that exceeded normal operational parameters. Computer models could predict Elena's behavior with reasonable accuracy, but they couldn't provide solutions for the resource limitations and procedural constraints that would prevent effective response to the storm's impact. Rodriguez understood that successful helicopter operations during Elena's aftermath would require crews willing to operate under conditions that pushed aircraft and personnel to their operational limits. Standard safety margins that applied during routine emergency operations would need to be adjusted for the unprecedented circumstances Elena would create. Flight crews would face situations where strictly following established procedures might prevent them from providing assistance to people whose lives depended on immediate action. The briefing concluded with Morrison's emphasis on maintaining operational discipline during the critical hours when Elena made landfall and immediate aftermath. Emergency personnel would face enormous pressure to respond to developing situations, but premature action could compromise their ability to provide effective assistance when conditions improved enough to make successful operations possible. The strategy required accepting that some emergency situations couldn't be addressed immediately, a reality that conflicted with the fundamental motivations that drew most people to emergency services. Foster's final weather update confirmed that Elena would make landfall within approximately 4 hours, bringing with it conditions that would test Port Harrison's emergency response capabilities more severely than any previous storm. The hurricane's unique combination of intensity, speed, and timing was creating a situation that demanded both strict adherence to proven safety procedures and flexibility to adapt when those procedures proved inadequate for actual conditions. As the briefing ended and personnel dispersed to their assigned positions, the Operations Center settled into its storm watch routine. Radio traffic increased as Elena's effects spread throughout the region. Weather monitoring systems tracked the hurricane's approach with increasing precision. Communication networks maintained connectivity with external agencies despite growing interference from wind and precipitation. Emergency response personnel prepared for a long night of monitoring conditions they couldn't immediately address in developing situations they might not be able to resolve until Elena passed through their area. The systematic approach that had served Port Harrison well during previous emergencies was about to face its most severe test. Elena represented challenges that exceeded the assumptions underlying established emergency response procedures, and the storm's unusual characteristics would soon reveal whether rigid operational frameworks could adapt quickly enough to address unprecedented circumstances. In less than 4 hours, Hurricane Elena would begin testing every aspect of Port Harrison's emergency response capabilities, and the decisions made during those critical hours would determine how effectively they could protect and assist their community during one of the most dangerous storms in recent memory. Morrison remained in the Operations Center as his staff implemented final preparation procedures, but his attention was increasingly focused on the gap between Elena's likely impact and available response capabilities. The storm was creating a situation where traditional emergency management approaches might prove inadequate, and successful operations would likely require personnel willing to operate beyond established procedural boundaries when circumstances demanded immediate action. Despite marginal conditions, the next several hours would test not only Port Harrison's emergency response systems, but also the judgment and courage of individual personnel when confronted with situations that required choosing between following established procedures and taking action to save lives. Elena was approaching with unprecedented characteristics that would challenge every aspect of emergency operations, and the storm's aftermath would likely reveal whether their sophisticated systems and careful planning could adapt to circumstances that exceeded normal operational parameters. The emergency radio frequency crackled with desperation as Frank DeLuca's voice cut through the static one more time. The veteran school bus driver had been transporting 8 children and 2 teachers back from a marine science field trip when Elena's storm surge arrived 3 hours ahead of schedule, turning familiar roads into impassable rivers and forcing him to seek shelter at Riverside Elementary School. Now, as water rose steadily around the building and wind speeds climbed toward hurricane force, his situation reports were becoming increasingly urgent. Port Harrison emergency. This is bus 47 at Riverside Elementary. Frank's voice carried the controlled tension of someone fighting panic while trying to protect the children in his care. Water level has reached the first floor. We've moved everyone to the second floor, but the building's starting to shake. We need immediate evacuation. 12 souls on board, including 8 kids between 6 and 11 years old. Tommy Chun monitored the transmission from his communications console, documenting every detail while fighting his own growing sense of helplessness. The bus driver's reports had been coming in every 15 minutes for the past 2 hours, each one painting a progressively darker picture of conditions at the school. What had begun as a routine request for assistance had evolved into a life-threatening emergency that was testing every limitation of Port Harrison's emergency response capabilities. Mrs. Betty Collins, a 30-year veteran teacher who'd shepherded countless children through field trips and emergencies, had taken charge of organizing the group on the school's second floor. Her calm voice occasionally came through the radio as she provided updates about the children's condition and the building's structural integrity. The elementary school had been built in the 1960s to accommodate the area's growing population, but it hadn't been designed to withstand direct hurricane assault or the kind of storm surge Elena was producing. Commander Morrison stood behind Tommy's communication station, his expression reflecting the weight of decisions that offered no good options. Elena's compressed timeline had eliminated every conventional rescue approach. Ground vehicles couldn't navigate the flooded roads that surrounded the school. Marine assets were secured and couldn't be deployed in current conditions. Helicopter operations remained suspended due to wind speeds that had already exceeded safe flight parameters and would continue climbing for several more hours. Dr. Foster reviewed weather data on nearby computer screens, her meteorological analysis, confirming what everyone in the operations center already understood. Elena's unusual characteristics were creating conditions that fell outside normal emergency response protocols. The hurricane's rapid approach had compressed evacuation timelines beyond manageable limits. Its intensified storm surge was flooding areas that had never experienced significant water accumulation during previous storms. Most critically, its sustained wind speeds were preventing helicopter operations during the exact time period when such operations were most desperately needed. Current sustained winds at Riverside Elementary are 95 miles per hour with gusts to 120, Foster reported, her voice carrying the professional detachment required to deliver devastating information. Conditions will continue deteriorating for at least 3 more hours before beginning to improve. Even our most capable aircraft can't operate safely in these conditions. Captain Rodriguez reviewed helicopter capabilities one more time, hoping to identify some overlooked option that might enable rescue operations despite Elena's extreme conditions. Rescue 47 represented the station's most advanced aircraft, equipped with upgraded weather radar, enhanced navigation systems, and structural modifications that improved its performance during severe weather operations. However, even the Jayhawks' impressive capabilities had operational limits, and Elena's conditions exceeded those limits by significant margins. The manufacturer's specifications are clear, Rodriguez explained to Morrison. Maximum operational wind speed for the MH-60 is 80 miles per hour sustained, with gusts not exceeding 100 miles per hour. Current conditions are 15 to 20 miles per hour beyond those limits, and the gap is widening as Elena approaches. Attempting flight operations under these conditions would likely result in aircraft loss and crew casualties without successfully reaching the school. Lieutenant Walsh coordinated with emergency management officials throughout the region, hoping to identify alternative resources that might provide assistance to the trapped group. Coast Guard stations along the Gulf Coast were dealing with similar conditions and had suspended their own flight operations. Military helicopter units at nearby bases were grounded by the same weather conditions affecting Port Harrison. Emergency services from inland areas lacked the specialized equipment and training needed for water rescue operations in hurricane conditions. The regional emergency management network that normally provided mutual aid during major disasters was overwhelmed by Elena's unprecedented impact. Every agency was struggling with similar problems created by the storm's accelerated timeline and extreme intensity. Resources that should have been available for coordinated response were committed to protecting emergency personnel and equipment from Elena's destructive force. The sophisticated interagency cooperation agreements that worked well during routine emergencies were proving inadequate for a storm that exceeded all normal operational parameters simultaneously. Frank DeLuca's voice returned to the radio frequency with increasing urgency as conditions at Riverside Elementary continued deteriorating. Emergency. Bus 47. Waters reached the second floor now. Building shaking badly with each wind gust. These kids are scared, and I don't know how much longer this structure will hold. We need help now, not in 3 hours. The psychological impact of monitoring emergency calls while being unable to respond was becoming evident throughout the operations center. Emergency services personnel who dedicated their careers to helping people in danger were forced to listen helplessly as conditions worsened for 12 people whose lives depended on assistance that couldn't be provided under current circumstances. The emotional stress was particularly acute for personnel who understood that delayed response often meant the difference between successful rescue and tragedy. Morrison faced the kind of command decision that defined careers and haunted commanders for years afterward. Elena's conditions made immediate rescue operations impossible according to established safety protocols and aircraft performance specifications. Attempting such operations would likely result in additional casualties, while failing to assist the people already in danger. However, waiting for conditions to improve might mean waiting too long for the 12 people trapped at Riverside Elementary. Dr. Foster's weather analysis offered little hope for rapid improvement. Elena's eye was still hours away from making landfall, and dangerous conditions would persist well into the following morning. Computer models suggested that the earliest possible window for helicopter operations wouldn't occur until approximately 6 hours after the school group had reported rising water levels. Structural engineers consulted by radio estimated that Riverside Elementary's 1960s construction wouldn't withstand hurricane-force winds and storm surge for more than 4 to 5 hours. The mathematics of the situation were brutally clear. The school building would likely collapse before weather conditions improved enough to make rescue operations possible using conventional procedures and safety protocols. Emergency response systems that had been designed to handle multiple scenarios simultaneously were failing when confronted with a single storm that exceeded all normal parameters. Sophisticated equipment and careful planning were proving inadequate for circumstances that demanded immediate action despite conditions that made such action officially impossible. Rodriguez's flight crews remained on standby despite the suspension of operations, but their readiness was becoming increasingly theoretical as Elena's intensity continued climbing. Helicopter pilots who'd volunteered for emergency services specifically to help people in dangerous situations were forced to wait while conditions made their specialized skills unusable. The disconnect between capability and authorization was creating exactly the kind of operational paralysis that emergency response systems were supposed to prevent. Tommy monitored communication traffic from across the region, noting similar reports of people trapped in flooded areas, where rescue operations couldn't be conducted under current conditions. Emergency services throughout Elena's impact zone were receiving desperate calls for assistance that they couldn't answer due to weather conditions that exceeded operational safety limits. The storm was creating region-wide emergency situations that overwhelmed response capabilities and revealed the limitations of systems designed for more manageable disaster scenarios. Mrs. Collins' voice came through the radio with a teacher's practiced calm masking obvious fear. Emergency services, this is Betty Collins at Riverside Elementary. The children are holding together, but we've got water coming through the ceiling now. The building's structural integrity is compromised. Wind noise is so loud we can barely hear each other talk. These babies need help, and they need it soon. The human dimension of emergency response was becoming painfully apparent as Elena's impact intensified. Behind every radio call were real people facing life-threatening situations that required immediate assistance. Emergency services personnel understood that their primary mission was protecting those people, but Elena's characteristics were making that mission impossible to accomplish. Using approved methods and equipment, the gap between what needed to be done and what could be done safely was widening with each weather update. Foster's meteorological data confirmed that Elena's storm surge was exceeding all previous records for the Port Harrison area. Water levels in low-lying coastal areas had already reached 8 feet above normal high tide marks, and the surge was continuing to build as Elena's low-pressure center approached shore. Areas that had never flooded during previous hurricanes were experiencing inundation that transformed familiar geography into dangerous waterscapes where normal navigation references no longer applied. Morrison's command experience included hurricanes where difficult decisions had resulted in successful outcomes, but Elena represented challenges that exceeded his previous experience. The storm's combination of intensity, speed, and timing was creating scenarios that weren't covered in emergency response manuals or addressed by established protocols. Successful operations would likely require improvisation and risk-taking. That contradicted fundamental principles of modern emergency management. The Operations Center's communication systems provided real-time connectivity with decision-makers at state and federal levels, but higher authority offered no solutions for the immediate crisis developing at Riverside Elementary. Emergency management officials understood the severity of the situation, but they couldn't authorize operations that exceeded established safety parameters or provide resources that didn't exist. The sophisticated command structure that normally facilitated coordinated response was proving ineffective when local conditions demanded immediate action that higher authorities couldn't approve. Rodriguez reviewed aircraft performance specifications one more time, hoping to identify some overlooked capability that might enable rescue operations despite Elena's extreme conditions. Military helicopter operations manuals included procedures for missions under marginal weather conditions, but those procedures assumed wind speeds significantly lower than Elena was producing. Even special operations units with modified aircraft and extensively trained crews wouldn't attempt flight operations under current conditions. Frank DeLuca's radio transmissions were becoming increasingly difficult to understand as wind noise and structural vibration interfered with communication equipment. Emergency, bus 47, buildings failing. Need immediate, kids are. The transmission broke up completely, leaving only static and the sound of wind that threatened to drown out any human voice. Emergency services personnel stared at their radio equipment, hoping for additional transmissions that might clarify the situation at Riverside Elementary. The communication failure represented more than just technical difficulties. It symbolized The broader breakdown of emergency response capabilities when confronted with disasters that exceeded system design parameters. Sophisticated communication networks that provided reliable connectivity during routine emergencies were failing. When weather conditions interfered with radio propagation and damaged infrastructure, emergency services were losing contact with people who needed assistance at exactly the moment when such contact was most critical. Walsh attempted to re-establish communication with the school group using multiple radio frequencies and communication methods. But Elena's electromagnetic effects were interfering with most electronic systems throughout the region. Cell phone networks had lost coverage in the affected area hours earlier. Internet-based communication systems were failing as infrastructure lost power and connectivity. Emergency radio networks were experiencing increasing interference that made clear communication difficult and sometimes impossible. Morrison understood that his next decision would likely determine whether 12 people survived. Elena's passage through Port Harrison. Conventional emergency response procedures offered no solutions for their immediate crisis. Aircraft couldn't operate safely in current conditions. Ground vehicles couldn't reach the flooded school area. Marine assets were unavailable for several more hours. However, delaying action until conditions improved might mean delaying too long for the people whose lives depended on immediate assistance. The fundamental tension between safety and effectiveness that defined modern emergency management was reaching a critical decision point. Elena's characteristics had created a situation where following established safety protocols would likely result in preventable deaths, while deviating from those protocols could result in additional casualties and legal consequences for personnel who made unauthorized decisions. Emergency services were designed to help people in danger, but Elena was testing whether that mission could be accomplished when circumstances exceeded normal operational parameters. Dr. Foster's final weather update before Elena's landfall confirmed that conditions would continue deteriorating for several more hours before beginning to improve. The hurricane's eye was approaching Port Harrison, with sustained winds of 145 miles per hour and a storm surge that had already exceeded all previous records. Emergency operations would remain impossible using conventional procedures until well after Elena passed through the area, leaving 12 people trapped in a failing building with no officially approved means of assistance. The operations center fell into tense silence as personnel absorbed the implications of Elena's unprecedented impact on their emergency response capabilities. Sophisticated systems and careful planning were proving inadequate for a storm that challenged every assumption underlying modern emergency management. In less than an hour, Elena would make landfall with conditions that exceeded all operational safety limits, and 12 people would face the storm's full fury without any officially sanctioned prospect of rescue. Sarah stood motionless in the maintenance bay as Frank DeLuca's final transmission dissolved into static and wind noise, the desperate voice of the veteran bus driver lost somewhere in Hurricane Elena's electromagnetic chaos. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of radio communication. It was the sound of official emergency response reaching its absolute limits and acknowledging complete helplessness in the face of 12 lives hanging in the balance at Riverside Elementary School. Through the maintenance bay's reinforced windows, Sarah watched Elena's outer bands tear across Port Harrison with unprecedented fury. Rain didn't fall so much as explode horizontally across every surface, driven by winds that had already exceeded 100 miles per hour and showed no signs of diminishing. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through the facility as primary power systems struggled against conditions they'd never been designed to withstand. The very air seemed to vibrate with Elena's destructive energy, creating an atmosphere of impending catastrophe that penetrated even the most secure areas of the emergency response station. The maintenance radio continued broadcasting traffic from the operations center, where Commander Morrison's voice carried the weight of impossible decisions and Dr. Foster's meteorological updates painted an increasingly hopeless picture of conditions that wouldn't improve for hours. Sarah listened to Rodriguez explain once again why helicopter operations remained impossible. His professional analysis, correct by every measure except the one that mattered most to the 12 people trapped in a building that wouldn't survive. Elena's full assault. Sarah's fingers moved unconsciously across Rescue 47's maintenance checklist as her mind processed information that official decision-makers either couldn't access or wouldn't consider. She knew Elena's wind patterns from having flown through 3 previous major hurricanes. She understood how coastal geography would channel the storm circulation and create pockets of relatively calmer air that existed between periods of maximum intensity. Most importantly, she recognized that Elena's rapid forward movement would create brief windows of opportunity that conventional weather analysis couldn't predict with sufficient precision to include in official planning. The gap between Elena's sustained wind speeds and Rescue 47's operational capabilities wasn't as insurmountable as Rodriguez's briefing had suggested. Military helicopter specifications included conservative safety margins designed to protect aircraft and crews during routine operations, but those margins assumed normal operational parameters and standard mission profiles. Emergency rescue operations during hurricane conditions fell outside normal parameters entirely, requiring judgment about acceptable risk levels that went beyond manufacturer specifications and regulatory guidelines. Sarah had personally tested Rescue 47's performance under extreme conditions during previous hurricane operations. She knew how the aircraft handled when buffeted by winds approaching its theoretical limits. She understood the Jayhawk's auto-rotation characteristics if engine power was lost during flight. Her muscle memory included the precise control inputs needed to maintain stable flight when conventional flight envelope protection systems might provide inadequate guidance. Most importantly, she possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that came only from years of flying complex missions under dangerous conditions. The elementary school's location presented significant challenges for helicopter operations, but Sarah's intimate knowledge of Port Harrison's geography revealed approaches that wouldn't be apparent to pilots unfamiliar with local terrain features. Riverside Elementary sat in a natural depression that provided some protection from horizontal wind, but accessing that protected area required navigating between obstacles that would be invisible to navigation systems and dangerous for crews. Without extensive local experience, Elena's storm surge had transformed familiar landmarks into a waterscape that bore little resemblance to normal geography. But Sarah's mental map of the area included details that remained relevant even under flood conditions. She knew which streets would still be passable underwater and which areas would develop dangerous currents that could interfere with helicopter operations. Her understanding of local topography extended to knowledge about how flood patterns would affect wind behavior around buildings and trees that could create turbulence hazardous to aircraft attempting precision operations. The timing of Elena's approach created a narrow window of opportunity that official weather analysis was missing. The hurricane's compressed timeline meant that its eye would pass over Port Harrison faster than typical major storms. But the rapid movement also meant that periods of maximum danger would be shorter than normal. Between Elena's outer bands and the arrival of its most intense winds, there would be brief intervals when conditions might be marginal enough for helicopter operations by crews willing to accept risks that exceeded standard safety protocols. Sarah's analysis of the rescue scenario revealed challenges that demanded capabilities beyond normal emergency response parameters, but her experience suggested that those challenges weren't impossible for someone with appropriate skills and equipment. Reaching Riverside Elementary would require flying through conditions that officially exceeded aircraft limitations, but Elena's wind patterns would create brief periods when such flight might be possible for a pilot with sufficient experience and detailed knowledge of local geography. The elementary school building itself presented obstacles that would complicate rescue operations, even if aircraft could reach the area safely. The structure's 1960s design included architectural features that would interfere with helicopter approach patterns and limit options for positioning aircraft close enough to evacuate trapped personnel. However, Sarah's familiarity with the building stemmed from her own elementary school years there, and she understood layout details that weren't apparent in official facility drawings or emergency response planning documents. More critically, Sarah recognized that successful rescue operations would require speed and precision that exceeded normal emergency response procedures. Standard rescue protocols assumed adequate time for careful planning and systematic evacuation procedures, but Elena's conditions would allow only minimal time on site before weather deteriorated beyond any aircraft's operational capabilities. The rescue would need to be executed with efficiency that left no margin for error or extended ground operations. Tommy's voice carried across the maintenance bay from a portable radio he'd brought from the operations center. His communication, specialist training, evident in his professional delivery despite obvious emotional stress. "Sarah, I know you're monitoring this. Morrison's talking about waiting until morning to attempt rescue operations. Weather Service says Elena's eye won't reach us until after midnight, and conditions won't improve enough for flight operations until at least 6 a.m. That building won't last another hour in these winds." The unofficial communication from her brother provided information that official channels couldn't acknowledge. Tommy's position in the operations center gave him access to real-time weather data and command decisions that wouldn't be shared with maintenance personnel. His message confirmed what Sarah had already calculated from her own analysis of Elena's behavior and the elementary school's structural limitations. Official emergency response procedures were inadequate for the current crisis, and 12 people would likely die waiting for conditions that met established safety criteria. Sarah's decision crystallized as she absorbed the full implications of Elena's unprecedented challenge to emergency response capabilities. Every official analysis was correct within its own parameters. Wind speeds did exceed aircraft operational limits. Standard safety protocols couldn't be modified to accommodate current conditions. Emergency response systems weren't designed for scenarios that exceeded normal operational envelopes. However, those correct analyses were producing a collective conclusion that accepted preventable deaths, rather than attempting operations that involved acceptable risks for trained personnel with appropriate experience. The elementary school group included 8 children whose lives hung in the balance. Because official procedures couldn't adapt quickly enough to address Elena's unique characteristics, Mrs. Betty Collins had dedicated 30 years to protecting and educating children, and she deserved better than abandonment during her moment of greatest need. Frank DeLuca had safely transported thousands of students over his career, and his experience and judgment had earned consideration rather than institutional paralysis. Every person trapped at Riverside Elementary represented someone whose life had value that exceeded bureaucratic concerns about liability and regulatory compliance. Sarah's training and experience had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation, where conventional approaches proved inadequate and individual judgment became critical for successful outcomes. Her grounding had resulted from previous occasions when she'd chosen to operate beyond established safety margins in order to save lives that would have been lost under more cautious operational procedures. The disciplinary action had been technically justified but missed the fundamental reality that emergency response sometimes required accepting risks that exceeded normal comfort levels. Hurricane Elena was creating conditions that demanded exactly the kind of aggressive approach that had led to Sarah's grounding. The storm's characteristics exceeded all normal parameters and made standard procedures ineffective for addressing immediate emergency needs. Successful rescue operations would require someone willing to operate beyond established safety limits and accept personal responsibility for outcomes that couldn't be guaranteed under current conditions. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her current position provided better access to operational intelligence and aircraft capabilities than any active flight crew possessed. Her maintenance duties had given her unprecedented familiarity with Rescue 47 systems and performance characteristics. Her monitoring of communications traffic provided real-time awareness of developing conditions throughout Elena's impact area. Her understanding of local geography included details that weren't available to personnel who lacked her extensive experience with Port Harrison's unique terrain features. Rescue 47 sat 30 feet away, fully fueled and equipped for emergency operations that no one was authorized to conduct. The aircraft systems had been personally verified by Sarah during her evening maintenance routine. Its emergency medical equipment was properly secured and ready for immediate use. Its weather radar system had been calibrated for optimal performance under severe weather conditions. Every component was prepared for missions that official procedures wouldn't approve, despite urgent need for exactly such operations. Sarah's analysis of risk factors suggested that Elena's conditions, while extreme, fell within the operational envelope for someone with her experience and detailed knowledge of current circumstances. The hurricane's wind patterns would create brief opportunities for skilled pilots willing to accept increased risk levels in exchange for the possibility of saving 12 lives that would otherwise be lost. Standard safety margins existed to protect average crews during routine operations, but Elena's scenario demanded exceptional responses from personnel with above-average capabilities. The decision to act required accepting personal responsibility for outcomes that couldn't be guaranteed and professional consequences that were entirely predictable. Sarah's previous unauthorized operations had resulted in successful rescues, but also career-ending disciplinary action. Similar action during Elena would likely produce similar professional consequences, regardless of operational outcomes. However, the alternative was accepting that 12 people would die while resources that might save them remained unused due to procedural constraints that prioritized institutional protection over individual lives. Sarah's movement toward Rescue 47 wasn't driven by heroic impulses or disregard for legitimate safety concerns. It was the calculated decision of an experienced professional who understood that emergency response sometimes required individual initiative when systems failed to provide adequate solutions. Elena's characteristics had created a situation where established procedures were proving inadequate, and successful outcomes would depend on personnel willing to operate beyond normal comfort zones when circumstances demanded exceptional responses. The maintenance bay's electronic systems provided access codes and operational procedures that would enable unauthorized aircraft operations. But Sarah's decision to use that access required accepting full responsibility for consequences that extended beyond immediate rescue operations. Elena would pass through Port Harrison regardless of individual actions, but the survival of 12 specific people depended on someone's willingness to attempt operations that official channels couldn't approve despite obvious need for exactly such attempts. Elena's approach had compressed decision timelines to the point where further analysis would eliminate any possibility of effective action. Weather conditions would continue deteriorating for several more hours, and the elementary school building wouldn't survive Elena's full assault. The window of opportunity for rescue operations was closing rapidly, and delayed action meant no action for people whose lives depended on immediate assistance despite conditions that exceeded normal operational parameters. Sarah reached for Rescue 47's crew access panel as Elena's winds howled outside the maintenance bay, and Frank DeLuca's voice remained lost somewhere in the storm's electromagnetic chaos. 12 lives hung in the balance between official procedures that offered no solutions and individual initiative, that accepted risks others weren't willing to consider. The decision was ultimately simple, despite its complexity. Emergency response existed to save lives, and Elena was testing whether that mission could be accomplished when circumstances exceeded established comfort zones. The helicopter systems responded to Sarah's access codes exactly as they had during hundreds of previous missions. But Elena's conditions would test every aspect of her experience and Rescue 47's capabilities in ways that no training exercise or routine emergency had ever approached. The next few hours would determine whether individual skill and determination could overcome institutional limitations when 12 specific lives depended on someone's willingness to act despite conditions that made such action officially impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.